Hey everyone, it is the Enforcer, and I am coming to y'all with great and outstanding news tonight. Ukraine has survived the 14th day of the war. The Western analysts did not even think that Ukraine would survive 24 to 36 hours, but here we are, 336 hours or more into the war, and Ukraine still stands, mostly intact, and most of the country is still uncaptured by the Russians. The only major ground that they have made through the entire course of this war is the capture of the port city of Kherson. That is all they have actually captured in terms of anything of value and worth. So moving on from that, I'm going to talk about how we're going to be moving around the country today. We're of course going to start in the northern area around Kiev, move on to Sumi and Kharkiv, and we're going to cover the southern front all in one fell swoop, and we're going to answer questions in between the Kharkiv and eastern front, and then we'll answer questions in between the eastern front and the southern front. So with that being said, let's get to it. So the first thing we've seen today is that there has been an airstrike in Zhytomyr. As you can see here, it appears that the missile, well actually I'm sorry, it's not a missile, it's an aircraft, flew over and dropped bombs on a target. We don't know what the target was, but we do know that it apparently delivered all the bombs to where they were supposed to go, according to what we can see in the video.
Блядь, твари, блядь, мост уебал, сука, пидорасы, блядь, сядь, блядь, музыкалку взорвали, блядь, це пиздец.
We're not sure of the damage as of yet. We'll have to wait for a video to come out to show us what was hit and what was damaged and if there were any civilian casualties involved. So unfortunately, I don't have that information for y'all at the moment, but what we do know is that it appears that an aircraft, probably an Su-30 or an Su-27, Su-30, or an Su-34 type aircraft, delivered what looked like dumb bombs on Zhytomyr. Anyways, moving on from that area, we can see that around Kiev, not much has happened at all today, actually, according to video evidence. So we don't really know the situation in Kiev as far as film goes to confirm what the situation is. So as far as today, there's actually going to be no news on Kiev for one of the first times in the stream. But we do have some news around the town of Mikolaiv, that a logistical convoy of the Russians were destroyed. We have some kind of thermal footage here. I'm not really sure if this is thermal footage because it's not really on the black-white scale that it's usually shown in. Maybe this is a different kind of heat map, but nonetheless, you can see that the Russian convoy was destroyed right there. We can actually see more explosions going off over here on the left side. And it appears that we may actually be able to see what caused that. It looks like a helicopter of some sort, because if we see this little yellow dot up here, maybe it's a Russian helicopter. We don't have enough information to confirm or nor deny it was Russian nor Ukrainian, but it is popping flares. And so maybe it was a Ukrainian helicopter doing a strafing run on a logistics convoy, because it appears that it hit something maybe with an ATGM, and it had some kind of gun on the aircraft. Maybe it was like a Mi-24P. No, I'm sorry, a V with the 30 millimeter or 23 millimeter Gish gun that's on it, and it tried to wipe out the rest of the convoy with a gun. But I don't really know. That's really all kind of like an opinion and kind of like my assumptions based off what we're seeing in the video. So the story could be entirely different, but that appears to be what we saw in the video. So anyways, as far as we know, I'm going to give a bit of a current situation report as to what's going on in the area of Kyiv. We don't have any videos to back this up, but as we know right now, the front lines have remained static over the past 24 hours, and not a lot of ground has been made by the Russians nor lost by the Ukrainians. So as of the moment, it looks like the situation in Kyiv is probably status quo. But we'll have to get some more information as the day goes on tomorrow to see if that was true, or if there was just a lack of video evidence of anything going on in this area. So moving on from that, we've actually gotten a lot of videos from the area of Chernihiv. I would like to start off with probably the most interesting one, which is, it appears to be a group of police defusing one of the Fab 500s that fell into Chernihiv unexploded a few days ago. So here's the footage of that. That was expertly done, considering that I don't really know much about bomb defusals, but it looks like they did it quite well considering that they didn't explode. So I'm going to assume, and this may be nothing more than my opinion, of course, but I'm going to assume that that bomb defusal was a success and that nothing came out of the bomb afterwards, rather than just removing it from sight. So we're going to move on to the outskirts of Chernihiv. We can see that more medical vehicles from the Russian army are being used to transport ammunition and supplies to support the combat troops. So I'm going to show you all that real quick. As you can see, more ammo inside of this armored personnel carrier. And also, I just want to make clear again, you can see the red cross on the vehicle right there. This is clearly marked as a medical vehicle, and carrying, military, well, combat equipment like arms, ammunition, and so on inside of a medical vehicle, like it's some kind of logistical support unit, is a violation of the rules of war, because you're supposed to only use medical vehicles for like humanitarian and medical aid purposes. You're only supposed to be using them for that and nothing more. And so clearly marking a vehicle as a medical vehicle and then transporting ammo in it is, of course, a violation of the rules of war. And another thing that this may be suggesting, and this is entirely based off of the kind of like assumption I've been making through this entire war. You can check out my math. It's on the Discord under the useful links section to see where I'm coming up with this. But this may be the Russians trying to find every single vehicle that is still operable and using them to carry any supplies whatsoever. And so while it may be a blatant misuse of a red cross on the side of the vehicle, maybe they didn't paint it over and they just put the supplies in there because the Russian logistical situation is so poor that they're having to use any vehicle, including ones clearly marked as medical vehicles, to try and support any amount of supplies to the front lines, to the BTGs that are still trying to operate and fight in this war. So moving on from that, we're going to check out this Russian convoy that was destroyed near Chernihiv. This is another one, as you can see from the pictures here. They were, of course, wiped out as usual. This truck actually looks like a civilian truck, just like a normal civilian KAMAZ. And I believe I may be supported in that by saying that there are headlights in the bumpers. And I believe that only the civilian versions of vehicles in Russia are built with headlights in the bumpers as well. And the military versions only have headlights on the front hood. But I may be incorrect in stating that. Anyways, that actually looks like another one of those anti-air unit. I forgot what the exact name of it is. The Russians have so many little weird armored vehicles that I can't really remember all of the names. But I think we've seen about 2 or 3 of those been carried off by farmers at a point. It looks like some kind of SPAA vehicle. But, that's nothing more than speculation. It may be something else. So anyways, you can see that the Ukrainians are now starting to pick up this really interesting paint scheme where they paint the tanks, and trucks, as in this picture, yellow to cover up the Z's and anything else that identifies this as a Russian vehicle. We can see them doing that yesterday at Mikolaiv and Mariupol, and now we're seeing them do that across the entire country because this is up near Chernihiv. We can also see another T-72B3 from what it looks like that has been ditched on the side of the road, and it looks like it may actually be in good order, good running order, and then we can see one that's not in good running order. So that being said, another convoy destroyed, something of the usual stuff these days. So that being said, before we move on to the location unknown area and the Kharkiv area, we're going to answer some questions from the chat. And so what do we got, Drew?
So first up, John Dilly, 1974, chipping in 1999, asks, how many personnel are usually assigned per abandoned tank?
I'm not really sure. We haven't gotten any numbers on that. We do know that, of course, most Russian tanks are usually manned by 3 guys, but I don't actually know how many the Ukrainians will be assigning to either remove the vehicle from the area or repurpose it and kind of like refurbish it in a way to make it usable for the Ukrainians. So I don't really know. But thank you very much for the support, and I'm sorry I really couldn't answer the question too well. And so next question.
Next up, we have Nick Anderson asks, hey, Enforcer, what is the new update about Chernobyl power plant? When it's now without power, do you know about that? Thank you
Yes.
for your content.
Also, thank you very much, by the way, for the support. And at the moment, it appears that the Chernobyl power plant is without power. That's true. And I believe that they said that the generators, the emergency generators at Chernobyl that ensure that the reactors do have coolant moving through them, which is usually just normal water. That's why most nuclear reactors are near some kind of river. But I believe that they're still pumping water through them at the moment, but they said there's only enough fuel for the generators to operate for about 2 days. So they're going to have, the Russians, since they occupy this area, are going to have to find a way to refuel those generators, you know, maybe pull logistical units off the already strained front line to then supply these generators with fuel, so that way they don't have another meltdown. And as you know, the kind of like jet streams that move over Ukraine, excuse me, actually move from the Black Sea north. And so if this goes into another kind of like meltdown scenario that we saw in Chernobyl back in 1986, the radiation will once again fly north up into Belarus. And so I believe it's really more in the Russians' interest to battle this as fervently as possible, and also Belarus's interest, so that way they don't get more radiological damage in the surrounding environment. Because as you can see right here, the Palieski State Radio Ecological Reserve is actually an exclusion zone. It's not like a national park or anything, obviously. It's filled with radiation. And so you can already see the amount of land and damage that it's done before. So if they were to allow that to happen again, it wouldn't really be beneficial to the Russians nor their situation in the northern area around Kyiv, because this whole entire area could get radiated again that they're using to move logistics through. And so I hope that answers the question. And once again, thank you very much for telling me that you like the content. It means a lot to me. And so next question.
So real quick before the next question is read off, just heads up to the folks viewing. If you'd like to have a question answered, please use the @StreamEnforcer. That way your message will be highlighted. It's really easy to find the chats that have a donation attached to them. But if you want to have something addressed, please use the @StreamEnforcer. Next question or next comment comes in from Pavel Shvenko, chipping in $2. Says, thank you so much, Enforcer, Donna, Baka, and Let's Get Steve. Giving a shout out to the mods.
Hey, that's great. Thank you very much for the support to all the mods, and also thank you very much for supporting the channel again. But I told you, Pavel, don't support the channel. Save your money. You're probably going to need it sometime in the future. But anyways, that being said, we'll take one more question, and then we're going to move on to the location unknown area in the Eastern Front. So, last question.
All right. Next question comes in from Bruh, who had two separate donations of $10 and $20 respectively, I believe. Asks, have you seen the CCTV cam videos of the elderly couple getting blown up in their car? Is Russia using terror tactics now?
Actually, I did. Sadly, that couldn't go on stream because I really, honestly, it wasn't really graphic, but I felt like it was such a bad thing that YouTube would raise a problem with it, and I want to report this news constantly, and so I don't want the channel to get any strikes against it, because that means I couldn't upload for a week, and you know, the war could change a lot over a week, and I wouldn't be able to report on it. But yes, I did see that video, and it was very vile, how the Russians just rolled up on this car and just blew it to pieces and killed the couple inside. So yes, I did, and I believe that the Russians may be using terror, because as you know, actually yesterday, if you'd like to check out the map, I have a link in the description to it below. You can actually see right here that there was gunfire heard around the Sumi escape corridor that the Russians and the Ukrainians agreed on using. So that being said, yes, I do believe they're using terror tactics at this point, because it almost looks like they're targeting civilians directly, nearly at this point, due to how they're always just, by coincidence, having a firefight with the Ukrainians every time there's civilians in the area. So that being said, I do believe so. And once again, thank you very much for the support. I'm very happy for the support that you've given to the channel. It helps us out a lot. So that being said, we're going to now move on to the location unknown area and the Eastern Front as a whole. So I'm starting to call this the Eastern Front. I know that could be construed with World War II, but this is the eastern side of Ukraine, and so I just thought it'd be easier to call it the Eastern Front. So in the location unknown areas, the first thing we can see is a Russian soldier hiding in a tank. A Ukrainian is on top of the tank trying to get the guy out, but he's pretty determined on staying inside the vehicle. So I'll just let you all see the video.
Заблудші душі в Україні. Guten Morgen, Russen Schweine Soldaten. Вилазьте, блядь. Вилазьте, сука, і будете жити.
We're not really sure if someone was inside, but you know, the video also makes that clear too. It says allegedly, so there may not be a Russian soldier inside that vehicle, but there's really no reason to doubt that there isn't. But who knows? I mean, like I do find that kind of weird, but I think it was a really funny video in a way because there's just a Ukrainian harassing a Russian guy hiding inside of a tank. So, anyways, we'll move on to the next bit of news. We've seen that the Ukrainians have pulled out a relic and they're using a DP-27. Now, I don't know the actual logistical situation of the Ukrainians. It may be great, because honestly, we really have no information otherwise to suggest that it isn't at least good or mediocre. But we can see that they're using a DP-27, which is a really old machine gun. But on top of that, this thing looks to be in immaculate condition. So what I'm thinking is that this may have been in a museum nearby, and they're using the museum weapons as well as the modern ones. So anyway, nonetheless, regardless of where this thing came from, I think it's really cool that they're using a DP-27, although it's a pretty old gun. So moving on from that, that's really all there is to say about that. We're going to move on down to a video of a tank being hit by a javelin. This is a Russian tank, of course, that was hit by a ATGM. This was filmed by a drone as well, so we get a top-down view of it. By the way, the tank is right here where my cursor is circling. And so you'll see it get hit in a second. And it looks like it had an immediate ammo cook-off. So all the shells inside of it are burning. And it looks like the tank's actually still going in reverse too, which is really interesting. But nonetheless, more Russian destroyed armor, and on day 14, it looks like the Ukrainians are never going to stop in terms of destroying Russian vehicles. So moving on, we can see that some Ukrainian soldiers have posed with more... man, it's been removed. I'm sorry about that, y'all, but that one was removed. So, sadly, the pictures showed that a Ukrainian unit had captured a Russian T-72B3 and posed for pictures with it, but unfortunately that was removed, so I can't show it to y'all. Anyways, we're going to move on to the next bit of news that is a location unknown. We can see that there is a video from a Russian from his convoy as gunfire in the distance is targeting them. I don't really know why he's standing perfectly still, but nonetheless, I'll just show you all the entirety of the video. I believe at this point the video may be looping, but nonetheless you can see that it was a kind of drawn out firefight against the convoy. And it looks like the Russians had tanks, so I don't really know the success that the Ukrainians achieved later on. But I do know that at the moment the Ukrainians were fighting what appeared to be a heavily armed convoy, considering that it looks like it had support from some tanks. Or it may actually be trucks that were attached to a BTG. We don't really know either way, but what we do know for sure is that it looks like the Russians are getting their logistics stalled even more, and we already know that they can't afford that because their logistics are already spread thin according to our information. But then again, that math wasn't entirely accurate, so take that for what you will. So moving on from that, we're going to move on to the next bit of news, and we can see a skiff at work. This skiff in particular was it was an Arabic import, so apparently export. So it has Arabic script on the screen, but here's one in action.
Пиздатый, братан.
And as you can see, they wiped out another Russian armored vehicle. We're not really sure exactly what kind. We can't really see in the video, but we do know from that size of an explosion that it must have hit some kind of ammunition, a fuel tank, or something like that, but that tank will surely be out of action, or armored personnel carrier, for the foreseeable future, maybe even indefinitely. So that's very good news for the Ukrainians as they continue to fight on viciously into day 14. And I cannot emphasize that enough, that we are on day 14 at this point. That's been 14 days, and the Russians have only gained this much land. They've gained this area through here. They've gained this little area around Kharkiv, moving up to it. They have this little area around Sumi, and the lines in maroon are breakthrough convoys, so we don't really know if they control this area or not. We do know that breakthrough convoys were quickly and speedily driving down the roads through here, which suggests that maybe there's a Russian presence, but not a large one. And then they had this little area up near Krolevets, although we haven't heard news on that area for the entire week. So I don't really know what the condition of the fighting around there is, or if anything's happened for that matter. So we'll just have to wait and see as more information comes out on that area. But in the meantime, we're going to get back to the location unknowns. We can see a old Ukrainian couple who kicks out some Russian soldiers. Well, of course, it was deleted. It was very funny though, because the Russians entered their property, and like their kind of like backyard, kind of like little area that was fenced off, and they entered it, and this Russian couple came running out of their house and was screaming at the Russian soldiers, and so one of them fired their gun into the air, and the old couple just got right up in these soldiers' faces, even with the guy shooting in the air, and just started screaming at them, and they eventually actually screamed at them enough that they just decided it wasn't worth their trouble, and they went and left the property, and the old people chased them off, and it was a very funny video, but of course it was deleted. So we're going to move on from that, and we can see that a night raid that the Ukrainians conducted on some Russian vehicles was successful. I'll show you all the video. It's rather self-explanatory. So it appears that the Ukrainians are not allowing the Russians to have any sleep at night either, because it looks like they're going to start doing some night raids on Russian vehicles. And so if there's any Russians watching, or if anyone who is going to be giving information back to Russia, make sure to let them know that there is no possibility of sleep, because the Ukrainians will also attack during the middle of the night. I'm sure they've been doing that during the entirety of the war, but that's the first time we've gotten footage that happened almost right after a night raid, because the fires were still looking fresh and somewhat large, that was successful. So that being said, it's a very good thing to know that the Ukrainians are doing everything that they can with their dogged level of resistance to keep pushing the Russians back or hold them where they are in some places. So that being said, we're going to move on to the area of Sumi. Over here in Sumi, we've only had one thing happen today, and that's that some supply vehicles were captured. I'll show you all that right now. Okay, and this one right here, this is the video why I said maybe the Russians are having logistical issues and they're having to use some marked medical vehicles as supply vehicles. As we look at this one, we can tell clearly that this is some kind of ambulance. And yet, they don't show that there's ammo inside and there's nothing but what appears to be uniforms. And I also spotted something else interesting in there. Right there, there's a gas mask. And today there was a bit of news, and I'm going to expound on this a lot because this is big news if it were to happen. It was talked about a lot in the mainstream news today that the Department of Defense claims that the Russians may begin to use chemical weapons in Ukraine, which, according to what most people believe and kind of like how the Geneva Conventions work, chemical weapons are about the worst things you can use on the battlefield, next to a nuke. I mean, like, the nuke is kind of like in its own realm, but chemical warfare is about the worst thing that you can see on a battlefield. And this gas mask here, while it may be standard kit in the Russian army for troops to carry gas masks, kind of like how, during, I believe, Desert Storm and the 2003 invasion of Iraq, American soldiers also were equipped with gas masks as well. As far as I know at least even in the 1980s in West Germany, they were equipped with gas masks. So that may just be standard kit, but also it being there and the talk about chemical warfare usage may suggest that the Russians are trying to bring in gas masks so that way they can use chemical warfare. But then again, that's all an assumption and an opinion on my part, and it's kind of a stretch. So take that with a grain of salt for real, because I don't really think that it really has much of a basis to it. But trying to connect the dots of what we've heard today with what we're seeing here and what was inside of this ambulance, we may be able to assume that something like that may be occurring in the future, but I would find it highly unlikely, and we'll have to just see as time goes on. So moving on from that, we've covered everything in the location unknown in the Sumi area already. It seems like we're kind of blowing through the news that's happened around the country today. But anyways, we're going to move on down to Kharkiv, and we're going to take a look at the Caliber missile that was flying at incredibly low altitude. It looked like a much lower altitude than normal into Kharkiv. And so what this is suggesting to me is that this Caliber was reaching its target, and so it had already started to tip the nose down a little bit to start losing the altitude to head to, go on a final approach to the target. So anyways, I'll let you see the video. I don't know why, but that one just looks a lot lower than any of the other cruise missiles that we've seen being used. So I believe that one was actually heading into its target at that moment on like kind of a final approach or something of that nature. And so this is a video that was sent in by one of the Discord members that sent me this video, and I thank him so much because it's actually a very good video. It's actually the shelling of Kharkiv at night on day 14. And so I'm going to pull this up for y'all real quick. And as you can see, in the usual fashion, the bombardment looked to be very severe. It appears that the Russians are using almost nothing but MLRSs during this war. It looks like they're not using any kind of normal artillery piece, like, in the US it'd be like a 155 millimeter M777. It looks like they're not really using any kind of artillery pieces that could be very similar or relatable to that. It looks like they're using nothing but MLRSs of some kind, because we've never seen a bombardment actually that appears to be from normal artillery. It's all from MLRS. So anyways, we're going to move on to the last bit of news that we have from Kharkiv today, and I'm going to show y'all some more shelling, at least the damage from shelling that happened on March 8th, but the video was uploaded on March 9th, and so it went down as a March 9th event.
Завалить ебало. Просто пиздец.
So you can see that the damage in Kharkiv is extensive. We've been seeing this for days, so it's kind of almost a repetition of saying the same things as yesterday. But the damage isn't getting any better, and there's been no improvements to the condition of the buildings, of course, because there's no way to repair them in the middle of a war zone. But it looks like things are getting worse and worse for the inhabitants of Kharkiv, and that's just being truthful. Hopefully they can evacuate, and most of them have evacuated at this point, hopefully. because the damage is getting dire, and I really wouldn't want civilians to be trying to live in those kind of conditions, except for the soldiers who are trying to defend the strategically important city. And so, talking about the news in general around Kharkiv, I'm going to recap a little bit for everyone who may be new to the stream, and if you're new, welcome. Make sure to subscribe if you like the news and you'd like to keep up to date on this and hear this every night. It comes on at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. A couple of days ago, the Russians... Well, actually, it was about a week ago at this point. The Russians actually encircled Kharkiv, according to the mayor of Kharkiv, and what we knew was some breakthrough convoys. But at the time, we didn't know that. We thought the Russians had actually managed to move BTGs around the city and actually surround it and besiege it, which the technical term of a siege is if you're surrounded on all sides, and so that would be a siege. They were besieged, and then the Ukrainians found out that they were breakthrough convoys, destroyed them promptly, and then the siege was broken. And so at the moment, Kharkiv actually has road access, I believe, on the M03, the P78, and the M18, as well as the M103 heading west. But we don't know about the northern roads or anything beyond that. We may even think that at the moment there may be a front line that extends further out this way where the cursor's going. But we don't really know because we don't have any video evidence to back that up. And so if I don't have any video evidence, I really can't work off of assumptions because I try and work off of as little of them as possible. And so that being said, we've covered the entirety of the Eastern Front, except for this one area right here near Perluki. And I'm going to show you all that real quick. We can see some more Russian destroyed equipment. This appears to be some kind of armored car. And then we can see that there is some kind of equipment. It appears in the description, it says it's an RP-377 VM1 jammer. So I'm guessing that this jams communications or something of that nature. But as you can see, it was destroyed along with the tank. And so maybe this tank was some sort of like support vehicle that just jammed communications. I'm not really sure. I don't really know enough about the vehicle to really say anything in particular. But nonetheless, they have destroyed some kind of jamming device of some sort, which is good news. And nonetheless, in Preluki, in the Chernihiv Oblast, so we do know that that's right outside the city. So it could be around here, or it could be anywhere in kind of like a 180-degree semicircle, because I don't believe the Russians have made it through Preluki yet. So that being said, very good news. And so now we've covered the entire Eastern Front, and before we move on to the Southern Front, I'm going to try and answer some more questions. And so what do we got, Drew?
So we have George, New York's premier contractor, chipping in another substantial donation of $100, which is crazy.
Golly.
Says that today was his son's 11th birthday, and his son asked him to donate / distribute some of his gifts monies to help the war effort, and here he is distributing the young fellow's wish. Thank you for your part, and glory to the heroes.
Well, thank you very much. I remember that you were also the fellow who gave the $200 yesterday, and I have to say your generosity is incredibly nice, and I'm very moved by it. Really, it's so I really can't even. I'm really at a loss for words. I bet you can tell at this point because you've been so generous and gracious to this channel, and I thank you so much for it. And I don't even know what to say. I mean, like, I just thank you so much for the support. You're a very nice person, and I hope that the news that I'm saying is getting to the Ukrainians. As far as I know, it is in some areas, and they're getting some reports as to what's going on around the country because they don't really get that at the moment. So, anyways, Slava Ukraina, and I thank you very much for the support. I'm at a loss for words, really. I don't even know where to go with that. So I thank you very much once again. So with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
Next up is Maddie Wardlow, chipping in 1999, says weather excitedly. Is it colder in the north this week? Does cold weather favor Ukraine? And same question for spring thaw. Wonder if Russia is making some of the same mistakes that Germany made 80 years ago.
I'm not really sure about the weather condition today. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough time to collect that information. But I do know that the last time we got any information, it appeared to be snowing and cold near Kyiv. And my assumptions, not that this is found in fact, and there may be a lot of variables that may change what this assumption's basis is on, but cold weather is not conducive to the Ukrainians much at all, because cold weather will freeze the ground, and when the ground freezes, it becomes more solid. And so the Rasputitsa that was in the north earlier, you know, when it was just kind of a little bit warmer and there had been some rain and that like thick, weird, slushy kind of mud happens all around Ukraine. We that can't happen in the cold as easily, you see, and also with snow, because the snow will fall on the ground and it will start to freeze and help the ground become a little bit more stiff, as far as I know. And so it helps the Russians conduct more armored operations. Now, what would be more beneficial for the Ukrainians in that area is that if the ground was, you know, wet, some kind of wetness, whether what degree it is, it doesn't really matter, and warmer, at least above freezing, that would be much more beneficial for the Ukrainians, because the Russians would still be limited to the main roads. But at the moment, they may be able to move off the main roads, or the cold hasn't been around long enough, nor the snow, to actually produce any kind of actual changes to the surface of the ground to make it easier to move tanks. But we don't really know that information right now. And was there a second part to that question, or was that generally answering it?
The second part of the question is wondering if Russia is making some of the same mistakes that Germany made 80 years ago.
I don't. I believe that they kind of are to a point. I really believe that they're making almost identical mistakes to what they did in Finland in the Winter War in 1939. Logistically, they've had multiple different kind of offensives that have occurred. One going to Kiev, one going to Kharkiv. They have one going to Kherson and Zaporizhzhia at the same time, so that kind of counts as 2 in 1. And so you have 4 different offensives, and all 4 of these have to have 4 different supply lines, and that becomes incredibly complicated to operate, and so it begins to fall apart. Just like it did in the Winter War in 1939, they ran into the exact same situation. They had multiple offensives supported by, I believe, very scant logistics, and so it fell apart completely, just like we see now. And so I hope that answers your question. And once again, I thank you very much for the support. It helps out this channel a lot. And so we're going to move on to the next question.
Next up from Lone Star State with a cryptic donation of 1776 says, appreciate the due diligence, professional demeanor, and candid delivery of war effort updates.
Well, I thank you very much for the support. And I also like that you made it 1776. I actually like that year a lot because it, of course, is our year of independence here in the United States. So I thank you very much for the support. And I like that you actually like my professional demeanor, because I'm always uncertain if people kind of like a more hilarious kind of like form presentation, but I just feel like that'd be entirely tasteless in a war, so I wouldn't do it anyways. But anyways, I thank you very much for the support once again. And with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
Austin Ben chipping in $10 says, heard a rumor that main Russian war aim was to create a land bridge between Crimea and Russia to stop Ukraine from cutting off water to the peninsula. If that is achieved, might Putin talk peace?
At the moment, as far as we know, there actually is a land bridge right here from Rostov-on-Don. You move through the Mariupol area, down past Bryansk, Melitopol, and then straight into Crimea. And so, if we were to go off of that basis, he would be talking about peace right now. And so, with that assumption in mind, we can assume that he's not looking for just this, because he's already achieved that. And so, it looks like he's looking to achieve more. And it looks like the actual plans are more ambitious than trying to capture this one area alone, because it looks like they've already done that. But that was actually a really solid question. Not a lot of people have been asking about that. Crimea has kind of been suffering since 2014 from a lack of water because the Ukrainians dammed off some of the water access that went into Crimea. Due to, of course, it being in Russia's hands, and if Russia wants to control Crimea, then they'll have to pick up the weight and support the Crimean, the economy, the farming, and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, that was actually a really good question. And once again, I thank you very much for the support. And with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
Next question comes from Rainier, chipping in $10 to the channel. Asks, do you agree with me that the governments need to stop saying what they're sending to help Ukraine? Second thing, bring Ukraine pilots to the planes in whatever country let them fly them home.
I think I might know what he means. One thing I kind of have to agree and disagree on is that I do understand that it is kind of like an attention-grabbing thing when they say that they're giving a certain amount of weapons. But at the same time, they do kind of have to make that publicly announced, because if they don't, the Russians could claim that they're trying to do this stuff in secret and they're getting directly involved in the war, and they could make a whole bunch of other assumptions. Like if you're supplying them secretly, now you must be sending like support troops over secretly that are training Ukrainians, like TDUs, all that stuff. It could get into a huge diplomatic deal, and we're already in a tense situation with the Russians. So I believe that the West is trying to do as much as possible to make sure that that doesn't get exacerbated in any additional way than what they're already doing with the sanctions and the supplies. And the second part, I do see what you're saying. I don't really know how that will work, but I do think, as far as I know, that would be a good idea to have Ukrainian pilots be sent like to Poland and then have them fly the planes over into Ukraine. But I'm not really sure if Russia would still view that as NATO supplying the planes directly to Ukraine. One thing I've always been wondering since they've talked about this whole entire aircraft transaction is why not just load the planes onto train cars. I don't know if, that's feasible, because the aircraft wingspan is much wider than the train car. Is the wheelbases even narrow enough to fit on a train car? I don't really know any of that stuff, so it may be unfeasible due to that, but I don't know why they don't just ship it over on a train like they have been doing most everything else. And if they can't do it on a train, I know you can do it on a truck, because I've seen aircraft get moved around. I'm sorry. I feel zonked tonight. I'm actually very tired tonight too. I haven't gotten any sleep. But I know that they've been moved around on truck a bit. I've seen it on video before in the United States for some reason. But I don't know why they're not moving it across via land into Ukraine, so that way they won't be just flying it into Ukrainian airspace. But that was a very good question and statement, and I thank you very much for the support once again. It means a lot to the channel. And so with that, moving on to the next question.
Next question comes from Icky Saracen, chipping in 10 Australian, asks, do you think the Russians are using their older Soviet equipment and conscripts to soften Ukraine before they send in more veteran forces and advanced weapons?
At the moment, I actually don't think that is the case, because as we've seen since day one, the war has been developing, and we've seen more and more vehicles destroyed. And if they were sending in their worst equipment, they'd be sending in stuff like T-72Bs primarily. But what we've been seeing is that a large amount of the Russian armored vehicles alone that are being destroyed are some of their higher end stuff like T-80 BVMs, T-90As, T-80 BVs, T-72 B3s, and so they're the most modern and up-to-date tanks that they have in the Russian arsenal. And I believe I also have a picture up here from yesterday. Yes, I do. From yesterday, there was a picture that came out of this Russian T-72 that is like in boneyard condition. It's missing everything on the tank. Smoke grenade launchers, IR spotlight. It looks like it even has little spots to install ERA armor onto it. It's even missing a front fender. And this thing is being used in Ukraine at the moment. It's marked with a Z, which means it's in country. So going off of that, I actually assumed that the Russians sent in their best stuff and it's getting beat really bad, and now they're having to pull up a whole bunch of old stuff in their reserves and their conscripts, which they already sent in a decent amount of them along with the professionals. And now they're having to send in conscripts to try and bolster up the numbers and hopefully turn this war around for Russia, although it's probably not going to happen. But once again, I thank you very much for the support, and I hope I answered the question as best as possible. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next question, and then I'm going to cover the Southern Front. And it looks like we'll be covering the news really quickly today, so that being said, we may just have a decent length Q&A later on, so that way I can try and answer everyone's questions as much as possible. And so we're going to move on to the last question.
Next question comes in from Oscar W. Alcantara, chipping in $9.99. Says that I've heard that Kyiv had about 10 to 14 days of supply in case they got completely surrounded. Does this sound right?
I couldn't actually back that up because I've gotten no numbers from the Ukrainian side as to their logistical situation in any regard. So as far as I know, they could have anywhere in between 6 hours of supplies or 3 months of supplies within Kyiv at this point, or had it before the war. So I'm not entirely sure, and I'm sorry I couldn't answer that question well. It's just that I haven't ever gotten any information about Ukrainian logistics or Ukrainian casualties or anything. So I'm usually operating off of what we know about the Russians, because we get a lot more information about Russia than we do about Ukraine. And so that being said, thank you very much for the support, and we're going to move on to the Southern Front, and this will appease a lot of people who want to get to the news a bit quicker. So without further ado, I'm going to get right into it. So here at the area around the town of Kramatorsk, we've seen that there was a Tochka missile that landed around the area and did not explode, which was really weird and really interesting actually because it's entirely intact. It's just sitting there in an area of trees. You know, it's just sitting in a woods. Very odd to me. I don't really know why it didn't explode. Maybe it was actually dropped off there. This is in such well condition, it doesn't even look like it suffered an impact. It just looks like it was just put down right there, and then they left. So I don't really know why that missile's there and how it got there, but it didn't explode, and it's just sitting there on the ground, and that's really all we know at the moment about that. If I can get any more info on that, I'll make sure to let everyone know as soon as possible. So moving on from that, we're going to move over here to this area where we can see that the Ukrainians have destroyed a Russian column. And so I'm going to let this play for a second. And so it looks like they're combining kind of like video from the air and the ground in this one. And it looks like it just loops back through it again. But nonetheless, it's more Russian destroyed vehicles, which is very good news for the Ukrainians. Honestly, it's kind of gotten a bit repetitive, although there isn't much more to report. This actually gives us a decent idea of what's going on. But the Ukrainians have destroyed so many Russian vehicles, and so much of it has been on video. It's nearly repetitive at this point, but I'm very glad for that. It's better that it's repetitive than rarely seen, because we know that the Ukrainians are doing an incredibly good job defending their country. And so that being said, we're now going to move on to the area around Mariupol, and we're going to talk about the situation here more in depth. I usually give a decent aside about the city of Mariupol. Mariupol was actually captured by the Donetsk, Luhansk kind of like alliance republics in 2014, and it was the Azov Battalion. If you know anything about the Azov Battalion, then you just know. But they were kind of like a group that kind of sprung up in the 2014, kind of like, if you want to call them revolts, civil war, you know, Russian-backed proxy war in Ukraine. Nonetheless, it was actually captured, and the Azov Battalion pushed them out of the city of Mariupol. And so the Azov Battalion supposedly has a base around here, and earlier last week, the Russians had captured that base. So now the city's been entirely surrounded for the past few days. I believe it may be the entire week at this point, and they've been fighting for the city as hard as they can. It's a very pitched battle for Mariupol, because it's a strategically important city on the coast of Ukraine, much like Odessa is in the west. Kind of like it's kind of like the importance of Mariupol to the east. And so they've been fighting incredibly hard to hold this town. But the problem is that the Russians have cut off water supply and also heating to the city. Due to some weird reasons I can't really explain. There's apparently like some sort of heating pipe network that operates throughout most Eastern European countries. I don't really know if that's the case in America, but nonetheless, that's the case over there. And so the citizens are freezing. They also have no water. A child died of dehydration yesterday in the city. And so the situation is looking very bleak for the defenders in terms of supply. And y'all know I revolve entirely around supply. And so I feel at this point, it's only a matter of time until Mariupol falls. But the longer that Mariupol is held, the longer a Russian naval force that's somewhere out here in the Sea of Azov will be held off, and is also tying up a load of Russian units that could be further moved north to push this offensive towards Zaporizhzhia, and they're having to sit around Mariupol and try and fight for this town as long as they need to push the Azov Battalion either into the sea, which they really can't, or to make them surrender, or just completely destroy them and take the city. In one way or another, the situation is dire for Mariupol, but the Ukrainians are a very, very strong breed of people, as we've seen through this entire war. And so I believe, very much so, that they'll actually hold this town for much longer than anyone can anticipate. So if I was to put down a guesstimate on this, I would say maybe, oh man, let me think, maybe 4 more days to a week more, and that'll be about how long the city can last without any sort of reinforcements or supply or anything. And that's really a true testament to how far and hard the Ukrainians are going to fight against the Russians, is that they know there's no chance of this thing being resupplied at all. It's cut off too far from Ukrainian lines. If a Ukrainian convoy just tried to break through, it'd have to break through a front line up here, drive down this road, and not get blown up by helicopters or Russian aircraft, and then drive through another front line into the city of Mariupol to supply it with a very small amount of supplies. And so that being said, we've seen that a children's hospital was attacked today in Mariupol. I've also been told it was a maternity ward as well. But anyways, I'll just show you all the video of the damage because the damage is very extensive.
Третья больница, Мариуполь. Людей подоставали завалом.
The damage, of course, was extensive. There was multiple people injured inside of the hospital, and of course, sick children and pregnant mothers were inside the building, and so most injuries were among that category of people. And so I consider it to be a terrible crime once again by the Russians, because this building is clearly a landmark. As you can tell, before this fire burned the facade off the building, it was a brightly colored building. And so it wasn't, it didn't mix in amongst the Khrushchevka commie blocks that they have all throughout Ukraine and Russia. It was a very distinct building, even in color. And considering that it's most likely highlighted on a Russian map, a military map of Mariupol as a hospital, I find it very egregious that they would have attacked it, because as far as we know, and the information we have, is that Ukrainian forces actually weren't even at this hospital. And it's just that the Russians began to attack the hospital. And so it's insane. It's once again another example of the Russians just losing their minds and violating the decency of civilians and just directly attacking them. But there's really no other way to explain it. The Russians just appear to be losing their minds in terms of attacking civilians, and hopefully the Ukrainians will make them pay for what they've done. And so moving on further into Mariupol, to our only other bit of news is that we've seen video of a Bayraktar in action. And of course, this has been deleted. The video was showing from a Bayraktar drone that it was destroying a Russian convoy somewhere on the outskirts of the city of Mariupol. I couldn't tell you exactly where because there was no defining landmarks and it didn't give a precise location of where in Mariupol, but the damage did appear to be extensive on the convoy. It looks like about half of it had been destroyed just within the course of the video, and the video cut out, and so we don't know if the rest of the convoy was destroyed or if the aircraft had to return to an airbase to rearm and refuel. So we don't know the condition of the convoy beyond what we saw in the video, but we do know that the defenders of Mariupol are holding, and the Russians, of course, are pulling every single sick trick that they can out of the book to try and take the city down. And so that being said, we're going to move on up towards Zaporizhzhia, where we've seen that where a Mista SPG was entirely destroyed. And so I'll show you all this video because it speaks for itself.
Заправку. Проходим тут мимо. Лежит. Ствол нахуй от танка, блядь.
Нет, я танка.
Гаубица это не танк.
Ну, бля. Похоже на них.
Разворочено нахуй все. Гусеницы валяются. Коленвальчик лежит.
Кому нужен металл?
Вот он, родимый.
As you can see, it looks like there was really nothing left of any of the vehicles in that video. I don't know what hit them, but whatever hit them was apparently pretty severe because it blew them literally and almost into non-existence, into oblivion, as some people would like to say. So going off of that, we know that the resistance heading towards Zaporizhzhia, and you may also notice that this front line has been adjusted a little bit, because I found out that the Ukrainians have actually pushed the Russians, at least their breakthrough convoys, back down to the area around Inodohar, kind of like on that same parallel. So that's very good news, because we know that the city of Zaporizhzhia won't be under direct threat for some time for now. It may not even come under threat for the rest of the war if the Ukrainians are able to hold their positions down here. So that's great news for the Ukrainians. And of course, I always have to mention that an offensive of that nature is incredibly good because, as we can see, it's a big morale boost. It's really a big morale boost to me, and I'm not even directly inside of Ukraine involved in this war. I'm just reporting on it from afar here in the U.S. And it's always a good thing to hear great news like the Russians were pushed, the Ukrainians were pushed all the way into Kiev to the Kiev zoo, and then they managed to push the Russians all the way back out of the city and up towards the area of Hostomel, Bucha, and Irpin. So I think that's incredibly good news that they've been able to do the same thing near Zaporizhzhia, and hopefully they can keep that kind of front line stable down there, although it's going to be very difficult considering that the southern front is an entirely different beast than the rest of the fronts that are currently opened by the Russians in the rest of Ukraine. And so moving on from that, we're going to start covering the news around Kherson, Mikolaiv, and we're going to cover the Vasily Baikov again. I know I covered it a few days ago, but there's been more news that came out about it, and I have to mention that, and I believe that will be all the news for the day. I know it was kind of short, but unfortunately there wasn't a lot of information that came out of Ukraine today. So we'll just go to answering as many questions as possible for the rest of the stream. And so finally in Kherson, we can see that a riot has broken out inside of the town. And so I'll just show you the video. It's very self-explanatory. People are extremely angry. I would just like to back up for a second and show this panning shot of the crowd again. Let me make sure. That's a huge crowd that we can see in this one small clip right here. It looks like there's at least hundreds, if not maybe thousands of citizens from Kherson that are in this kind of like protest slash riot. It's almost on like the borderline of becoming a riot. And hopefully it would become a riot, and hopefully they'd start destroying Russian vehicles in the process of doing that. But we know that the city of Kherson has been putting up a dogged resistance, at least on the civilian side, in their protests, riots, and so on, for the entirety of Russian occupation. So we know that the civilians of Kherson are not pleased at all with what's going on with the Russians invading Ukraine, and that the Russians' narrative of them, you know, quote unquote, liberating the poor Ukrainians from the fascists and so on, isn't true at all, because you can see these people much more enjoyed being under Ukrainian rule than Russian rule, and so that obviously tells us that they weren't oppressed. But anyways, I'll continue the video. It appears that there were some guys at the front of the crowd trying to make them disperse or go away. That looks like they were a part of the kind of like protest. And I don't really understand where they're coming from trying to make the Ukrainians disperse. They obviously know the kind of feelings that these people are feeling. They're pissed off, and rightfully so, that they're under Russian occupation, and they never wanted to be under Russian occupation. And now the Russians are using their city as a propaganda base to sit there and talk about how, oh look, we've liberated them. Look, we're giving them food and warm clothes, like they're starving children in Africa or something. Like, these people don't dress for cold weather, yet they live in Ukraine, and it's a cold country. I don't understand where the Russians are coming up with that stuff. But anyways, you can see that the citizens of Kherson are not pleased with this at all, and they're making sure that the Russians know very clearly that they're not. Now, if that will start to devolve into the Russians shooting these protesters like we've seen in other cities, we could start seeing these protests go a little more underground and a little much more violent, probably towards Molotov attacks towards the Russians. Because while it doesn't seem sensible, anger does not make people work in sensible ways, because a lot of people would say, yeah, throw a Molotov at a tank, it'll just blow you away. Well, people who are pissed do not care about that sort of stuff. They're just going to go and throw the Molotov at the tank because they're pissed. And so I believe that if the Russians begin to act very aggressively towards these kind of like protesters / rioters, you're going to start seeing the Ukrainians take more drastic actions to show their resistance to Russian occupation. And so moving on from that, we're going to move on to the area around Mikolaiv, as we've seen a decent amount today. Once again, it appears that Mikolaiv has become some kind of a hot zone in terms of the fighting, as it appears that the Russians are trying to capture the city, as it's critically important to them, because some people are saying that they're actually needing to capture Mikolaiv to then go to Odessa, because they're not going to land a naval invasion. They're actually going to do a land invasion of Odessa and then land a naval invasion near Odessa after the ground has been secured. And while that doesn't really seem like it makes sense that it still be called a naval invasion if that's the case, it does look like that's what they're doing, because at the moment they haven't landed a naval invasion over the course of 2 weeks at Odessa, and it appears that the heavy fighting here at Mikolaiv suggests that they require this bridge over the what's this river called, if we can get a name for it. I'm sorry, I'm not going to try and pronounce that, because that looks a little bit too difficult for me. But they're trying to get this bridge to cross the river, because the next bridge up, there actually is no next bridge up except for up here at Voznesensk. So they would have to travel some probably 75 miles north to get to that bridge, and then cross the river, and then start heading down towards Odessa. So this bridge is much more important, and also it's probably on a much more established roadway, because it's going into a major city, and it's also the connection of one side of the major city to the next. So based off of that, this must be why it's a hotspot. Nonetheless, we've seen that 2 T-72s were destroyed. I'll show you all that right now.
Привет, іди ти нахуй. Єбать, оце тут попадання було пізда. Угу. Да. Ебать.
Ебать, аж металл, сука, поплавать.
Ти прикинь, яка піздюліна була, на. Понятно, що вони по ракові їбашили, на. Пізда, геть, ну. Та да?
Wait a minute, hang on. I want to take a look at that real quick. I was just thinking about that, and I may have just... Doesn't this look like the same tree line that we saw the other day, where the Kamaz trucks were carrying the mortars, and also it appears ammo crates for those mortars? Maybe this was an entire convoy, maybe like half of a BTG that was wiped out on this one tree line alone. Maybe these two videos are interconnected with each other. As you can see, the anti-javelin cage on top of this T-72 didn't save it.
Скільки ця гусінь важить? Кум, обніми дугло, блядь, на відео.
Мы с Вознесенска! Пидорасы!
So as you can see, more destroyed T-72s, more good news for the Ukrainians, more bad news for the Russians, because if they lose T-72s that are actually in good condition, we may start seeing more of those T-72s that we saw up here in this picture. By the way, the link to this map is in the description below if you'd like to take a look at it. And you can also find the link in the Discord server, although I don't believe this one's been uploaded yet tonight. But nonetheless, you can take a look at that Boneyard T-72 for yourself. It's up there in the location unknown section, and I believe it's the first maroon-colored marker at the top left side of that kind of like area of unknown markers. Anyways, we're going to move on into the area of Mikolaiv itself. We can see that a BTR ZD was captured near Mikolaiv, and so I'll show you all that.
Пане генерале, за вашим наказом. Отжатая БТР-ЗД. ЗУшечка.
As you can see, this is kind of like a SPAA version of the BMD, but nonetheless, I'll just let the rest of the video play. So they've captured one of these. I don't really know how prevalent these are in the Russian army or how effective that kind of AA system would be in the modern day. I'm sure it's more effective than nothing, but would it be as effective as a man-pad is the question I'm always wondering, because it does have to be manually aimed, and the aim always has to be, you always have to lead the aircraft manually, and there's a whole bunch of variables in that people can get wrong. And so I wonder if this kind of self-propelled anti-air is still even effective in the modern war, or are they starting to repurpose these for more practical uses like at sea these days, such as anti-infantry or infantry support for their BTGs, kind of like a heavier firepower version of a normal BMP, I'm assuming. But I don't really have a lot of information to back that up. So this is all kind of like assumptions and opinions on my point about how they would actually use a BTR-ZD in the modern kind of like war, in a way. So anyways, moving on from that, we've got our last bit of news in the area of Mikolaiv, and that's a shell hits a house inside Mikolaiv right next to this person. I'll let you watch the video. It's pretty self-explanatory. As you can see, the Russians are directly shelling their the civilians in Mikolaiv as well, as they're doing everywhere at this point. And this tells me that the Russians have not done a lot of training that a modern army would, like the United States, that tries to focus on mitigating civilian casualties to a point. Although we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, sometimes civilian casualties were kind of unavoidable due to how some of the some of the enemy soldiers fought over there. You know, if you look at the Iraqi Republican Guard, or if you look at the Mujahideen or the Taliban, you can see that they usually use civilians as a shield, and so I guess in a way, civilian casualties over there were kind of unavoidable. But here in Ukraine, you can clearly see in the videos that there's no military units around this area, and it just looks like the Russians are barraging the city like it's World War I, and they're trying to break up these soldiers inside of their trenches before they send some troops over the top. And warfare is not fought like that anymore. And so you can tell that the Russians still have not really developed any sort of new strategies out of the Cold War. They're still in this kind of like armored wave, total war kind of strategy that they've had ever since like the 50s or the 60s. Maybe even all the way back to the 40s if you want to trace it to its infancy. But nonetheless, we have one last thing, and that's that captured vehicles were being transported on truck in Mikolaiv. I don't know if they're being transported out of the city or into the city, but I'll let y'all see the video. As you can see, it's a nice little capture. It's not a lot of vehicles, but it's a decent amount. And it's always good to have some replacement vehicles, because we know that the Ukrainians are not taking as many losses as the Russians, but they are taking enough losses that replacement of the, destroyed vehicles that they have suffered helps them out a decent bit. And so that being said, we've actually covered all the, well, I forgot the most important news today, and it was saved best for last, and I just saw it, and I'm going to cover this whole entire story from front to finish, because we've gotten the whole entire story now, and it's the first of its kind in history. So we've seen history be made today, as the Vasily Baikov has confirmed to have sank. This started several days ago. Actually, it started on day 12, as far as the information we knew. Really on the night of day 11, but then this carried over into day 12. The Vasily Baikov is a stealth corvette that the Russians made. It was a project ship. Its actual designation is something like Project 26617, something around that area. But nonetheless, it's the only one of its kind. It has a crew complement of 80, and it is a really cool looking ship. I'll pull it up for y'all real quick so that way y'all can see what I'm talking about, because it is a really neat looking stealth ship. If I had to relate it to looking like anything in particular, it kind of shares a decent amount of similarities to an LCS Freedom class ship, although you can kind of see where there would be some differences in that. But here's another picture of it. Maybe this one's a higher graphic. Yes. So this is the exact ship that I'm talking about. So I do not know the exact way the Ukrainians did it, but the Ukrainians set up this ship to where it would be distracted and led into a specific area. I guess you could call it a kill zone if you'd like, because that's what it turned into, where the Vasily Baikov would sail through. And so what they did is that they had multiple MLRSs, and we can see one of these right here, and I'll show y'all that in a second, that were on the coastline, and they all aimed at a specific spot in the sea. And you see the MLRSs have a certain area of dispersion. You know, when they fire, it's like, I'm not really sure how wide it is, but let's just say for the sake of the story and keeping it brief, it's about 200 meters wide. And so they were all aimed at this specific spot, and the Vasily Baikov started to sail towards the spot in a perfectly straight line, and so the MLRSs started to fire in advance, and I'll show you this video right now. As you can see, they did one night as it was filmed.
Августин, огонь.
And so these MLRSs started firing, and all of these rockets were heading to a specific spot in the sea that the Vasily Baikov would sail through in a matter of a minute or two. And so the Vasily Baikov started sailing through this area, and all of a sudden, all of these MLRS rockets start splashing around it and hitting it. And it's, I believe it was like at least 100 or 200 of them, because I think they said something like 3 to 4 MLRSs were involved in this little kind of like ambush operation, I guess you could call it. And so the Baikov was heavily damaged, and over the course of just a few seconds, all of these rockets hit this ship around it and caused so much damage that the ship was practically abandoned immediately. And next morning, we saw that there was, I'm sorry, that's actually a picture of the Baikov. We saw that there was a video of a ship burning at sea, and I said, I don't really think that's the Vasily Baikov because the silhouette doesn't look like it. And so here's what I got as an explanation today. These are actually two separate ships that are surrounding the Vasily Baikov, which is the ship that's burning here. And due to how the distortion that the sea creates on the horizon, you can't really see that well, and it looks kind of jarbled up. But apparently that's exactly what happened. And so these ships were Russian ships that had come to the Baikov's aid to help evacuate the abandoning crew. There was around 80 crew members. We don't really know how many were killed in the MLRS barrage, but we do know that the ship was damaged to the point it had to be abandoned nearly immediately. So the damage must have been severe, and so I'm assuming that there was probably a decent amount of casualties. And so the ship burned at sea, just like this, after the crew had been abandoned, for about 2 days, until today the news came out that the Baikov's burning husk finally listed over to the side far enough that it took on water and sank to the bottom of the sea. And so for the first time in history, and this is literally historical, a ship was sank by MLRS batteries on land. This is a historical event that will probably be talked about in naval warfare for years to come, because nothing like this is going to happen again. This is like, if I had to equate this to anything, this would be like using well, actually, yes, this would be a great example. This is like when the Prince Eugen sailed up the Oslo Strait past the Oscarborg Fortress, and the Oscarborg Fortress destroyed the Prince Eugen just days out of dry dock after being built, with Austro-Hungarian torpedoes that were built in the were made in the 1890s. It's almost similar to that. It's crazy that the Ukrainians were able to pull this off. And this tells you that the Ukrainians are being incredibly ingenuitive, or they're kind of problem solving in their ideas on how to destroy Russian vehicles and equipment and soldiers. And we can see here that this is probably one of the best shining examples in the war. And to also add a little bit of a closure to this, this is the exact same ship that they said attacked Snake Island and killed or captured some of them during that battle. So this kind of gives closure to the Snake Island story, as the ship that attacked the island is now been destroyed. So with that being said, we've actually covered all the news for today, and now I'll be taking questions. So what do we got, Drew?
So first up in the queue, Ksenia Volk, and I very much apologize for mispronouncing pronouncing that. Chippin 10 Canadian says, my family is currently sieged in Mariupol. It's worse than we were told. They're burying people in mass graves because of the non-stop bombing by Russia. What could possibly help this situation as soon as possible?
I hate to say it. Thank you for your support, by the way, but I'm going to be honest. I don't really know how Ukraine could help Mariupol at this point. It's so far behind the lines, and they would have to do such an effort to relieve the city that I just can't really see a viable solution to this problem. Unfortunately, sieges are tough, and I hate to hear that your family is currently stuck in Mariupol. That's a really sad thing to hear, and it really kind of brings it close to home, the news I'm reporting, because a decent amount of y'all are actually being affected by the things I talk about. And I hate to hear it. It's a terrible thing. Hopefully, I mean, like, really, not trying to be all doom and gloom, maybe the Ukrainians could launch some kind of counteroffensive. It would be a stretch, and it would take a lot of effort on the Ukrainians' part, but to try and reconnect the city, or perhaps some sort of humanitarian agreement can be made with the Russians, where humanitarian aid vehicles that carry food that can only be for civilians only can be carried into the city, to try and alleviate at least the hunger and dehydration issues that they're facing. But as far as the bombings go, as you know, I think that the Russians are practically war criminals at this point in every entirety across the entire war. And so, excuse me, my kind of stance on that at this point would be that the best thing I could see is the West threatening direct involvement if the siege of Mariupol is not lifted and supplies are allowed to enter the city immediately, at least for a 3-day ceasefire, so that way the Ukrainians can build up enough supplies in the city to at least keep the civilians well fed and well kept, or maybe try and create a humanitarian corridor, which this would probably be the easiest option and probably the most agreeable option, is to establish a humanitarian corridor where the citizens of Mariupol can leave and manage a ceasefire for a couple of days. I know they did that just about a day or two ago, and the ceasefire almost immediately fell apart. And actually, the Russians admitted that they broke the ceasefire. They said military operations have resumed in this area. You know, the Russian military is resuming the operations. And so I don't really know what the feasibility of that would be either, but one can only hope, because the suffering of civilians is a terrible thing, and I hate to write off that all these people will just be condemned to suffer through this entire siege, however long it may last. So hopefully some sort of solution, one of the ones I mentioned, can be reached, so that way this doesn't continue on indefinitely throughout the course of the war, because that would be unimaginable, the level of suffering that would be involved in such a thing. And so I thank you very much for the question, and I thank you very much for the support, and I wish and hope, and I will pray that your family will stay safe during the siege of Mariupol. And with that, we're going to take the next question.
Okay, so next question comes in from Andy Tasso, asking if you could touch on the Russian chicken marauders who appear unarmed. Are these deserters in the south?
I've seen the video, but the location was unknown as far as I saw in the video I watched of it. They may actually just be Russian soldiers that once again are suffering from a failed logistical system, and so they're just trying to find food however, and so maybe they just took the chickens just because they're trying to find anything to eat. So that being said, I mean, like, there's really a lot of variables that could play into that. Maybe they are deserters. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're starving because the logistics have fallen apart. Or maybe they're just trying to get some fresh food because they've been eating MREs for days and they think that they can probably, kill a chicken, skin it, and, well, not skin it, pluck the feathers from it, and have some nice chicken breasts or something like that. I'm not really sure much about the story rather than they were stealing the chickens. So I'm sorry I really couldn't answer that one too well. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
Okay. Next question comes in from Liberty Dude, and he says, not to be disrespectful, but from your knowledge as a historian, do you know if there's any record from historic wars where cities were sieged where the citizens and defenders had to resort to extreme means for survival, such as cannibalism and eating pets? And then also asks about if drilling wells is a viable option for acquiring water supplies.
To answer the drilling wells to acquire water, I don't believe that would be a good option at the moment because I'm sure they probably don't have the infrastructure to be able to undergo such projects around the city. They may already have wells. It's just that the amount of water that these wells can provide is low, or the wells are in a kind of like a battlefield area of the city, and so they can't be accessed by the civilians. Another thing that I would say is that yes, there has been cases where sieges have resorted to kind of like cannibalism and just debauchery like that. There's a lot of instances in Chinese history where a siege would last for quite a while, and then the army that was defending the city would start gathering up hunting parties to travel and roam through the city and capture and kill people so that way the army can eat them. So there has been examples of that, but that's a very rare instance that usually occurs, although it's not unheard of. I believe the siege of Leningrad, and we're going to pull up some more information on this so that way I can make sure that's true. Siege of Leningrad. I believe they were surrounded on all sides for years, but let me make sure that is true. If we can have a map. It doesn't really look like they were cut off entirely, but then again, the Finns were moving in from the north in the continuation war, so I mean, they probably would have been. I don't really know a lot of information about the siege of Leningrad, though. Yes, they were actually. They were actually entirely surrounded by the Finnish and the Germans. So I don't know if they actually resorted to cannibalism. Was there any cannibalism in the siege of Leningrad? I'm sorry if I misspelled anything in that typing. Yes, they did. But let's see here. Interesting. So there was cases of cannibalism. It doesn't really appear like they have hardcore information about how prevalent it was, but that is one example where civilians got to such a state that they would actually eat each other to try and find food. Hopefully that doesn't turn into the situation in Mariupol, since we were just talking about that, because that would be unimaginable. That would be nearly hell on earth. And so I hope it doesn't turn into that. So anyways, I thank you for the good question. That was actually a very great question. No, I didn't take any offense to you asking anything or anything like that. But I thank you very much once again. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
Ben Fran, chipping in $15 to the channel, asks or states, any thoughts why Russia hasn't tried shooting down the P-28 to Zhytomyr? I can't pronounce that word. And finally, to the Moldova border to cut off everything east and ceasing supply from Poland?
First off, if you're talking about an offensive from Transnistria is a very weird situation because it's kind of like a quasi-Soviet little mini country inside of Moldova. So the Russians probably want to be long.
Clarify. I just sent you the question within Discord, so you can read it for yourself.
Gotcha. I'll pull that up real quick.
Okay, because I want to make sure that we're addressing the question.
Let's see, Benfran 15. Any thoughts why Russia hasn't tried shooting down the P-28 to Zhytomyr and finally on the Moldova? A P-28. Let me pull that up real quick. P-28. Let's see what we get. So we get bread. I know you're probably not talking about bread. Let's see if we have anything that can suggest it's a weapon. Well, we get pistols. I don't really know what you mean by a P-28. I haven't actually heard of one of those, and I'm sorry if that's ignorance on my part. Shooting down the P-28 to Zhytomyr. I'm sorry, I really can't answer that part of the question because I really don't know anything about that situation, but I can talk about the Transnistria situation to a fairly good degree. And so, in Transnistria...
I'm suspicious that the P-28 could possibly be a highway?
Maybe? Let's check that real quick. Yes, it's a highway. It's a highway. So let's look at that question again. Why hasn't tried shooting down the P-28 to? Oh, okay. He's talking about shooting down as in driving down the highway to Zhytomyr. Maybe it's because they don't have the invasion force size nor the planning to actually launch a swift move down the P-28. Because as far as we know, this is as far as they've made it down the P-28, and so that's hardly at all. I believe their main focus is on actually trying to encircle Kyiv, because I feel like this would be stretching logistics incredibly far, because one, you actually would have to connect these two sides together, maybe down the, what's this road called right here? The P-56 that continues on down towards Zhytomyr, so you have to try and connect the P-56, the highway right here, I'm sorry I don't know the name of it, it's a major roadway but it's not a highway probably, to this road, and so you'd have a big logistical problem because there wouldn't be enough roads to supply something like that, or you'd have to start a whole entire other supply chain that runs straight down the P-28, which would be very hard to do because we already know that their logistics are stretched. So I don't really think that they are able to feasibly do that as far as I know, and that's all my opinion, so take that for what you will. Whether it be true or not, we'll have to see in the coming days if they are able to try something like that. But they could cut off supplies to Kyiv fairly easily, but we do have to remember that there is the rest of the country that supplies could be detoured through. And so while it may lengthen the supply lines, it wouldn't really cut them completely. So once again, I thank you very much for the support. It was a great, thank you very much for the donation. And it was a very good question. It's just that I didn't really understand it at the start. And I hope I answered the Transnistria one kind of earlier. Well, actually I didn't. I'll go over that one again. The whole situation with Transnistria as to why they can't really do anything effectively with it is because Transnistria doesn't really have the infrastructure to kind of like hold a large Russian-sized force, and on top of that, Moldova is landlocked. Romania is openly unfriendly with the Russians, and so there's no other way to get troops into Transnistria without an airhead to that area. And the problem is that Ukrainian airspace is still heavily contested, so they'd have to fly transport aircraft from Russia to Transnistria, which would be very difficult, very risky, and they probably end up losing a lot of aircraft and a lot of manpower trying to do that. So I just don't believe it's feasible for them at the moment, although I have been told that they do have troops in there. It's just not a sizable amount. So maybe they'll be used later on if they can actually secure Mikolaiv and move on to Odessa. The Russians will begin to push out of Transnistria because they'll believe that resistance is weak. But I don't ever believe they'll actually come to that point because Mikolaiv has been holding for quite some time, and the battlefield has been relatively static around that area. So I hope that's answered the question as much as possible, and once again, I thank you for the support. And with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
Next question comes in from Angela Van Earp, chipping in $9.99. Would crowdfunding a contractor security force help? Is this something that has been explored?
I believe the question is kind of asking about crowdfunding, kind of like a private military company, and I'm not really sure. Yes, okay, that's good. I'm not really sure because you see, really anything involving the military relies on a very high cost. I mean, like even if you're trying to run it cheaply, things become expensive because you have to provide the infantry with equipment, and the equipment is already expensive just to equip them with uniforms. If there's protective armor on them, of course you have to equip them with that. I believe that's generally standard in most armies these days, which adds a decent bit to the cost. You'd have to equip them with a rifle, gear. There's a whole bunch of costs just involved with an infantry's gear alone, and then you would have to support them with vehicles, and then vehicles cost a decent amount of money, and then of course there would have to be a constant flow of supplies, and so that's a lot of money. And so I think if there was a crowdfunded kind of like private military company, it would be incredibly small just due to the limit of the cost. So while it is a good idea, and I believe that it probably has been explored or will be explored, I'm not really sure if it would be effective. But then again, that's entirely my opinion, knowing how well people have been funding a lot of aid missions and humanitarian things for Ukraine. I'm sure that there actually may be a lot of people who would donate to it and make sure that it's successful. But I don't really know. I don't really have enough information to go either way. But once again, thank you for your support, and I hope I answered the question as good as I could. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
So the next question is in an alphabet that I don't know the letters, so I can't even attempt to read the name. But chipping in €5, what is the problem to supply the fighter jets to Ukraine? or any counter-air defense?
So the problem, I don't really know about the air defense side. No one's really explained that well, and I can't really find a good explanation to it online. But the aircraft side of things has been explained thoroughly by everyone as to kind of like the issues. There's been kind of like different opinions on it, but here's the gist. Poland and the United States are both members of NATO, and so either one of them flying the aircraft into Ukraine is kind of like NATO itself, the entirety of NATO, every single country involved in it, flying those aircraft into a war zone, a contested airspace. And so it's practically the United Nations, at least on the diplomatic side of things, getting directly involved in the war if they were to fly aircraft into that airspace. And so Poland is trying to figure out a way to send the aircraft over to Ukraine and hopefully not really have to get involved in the war in a direct way. And so the United States has kind of been pressuring them from some of the stories I've heard that they'll give them a whole bunch of F-16s. They'll give them 23 of them if they give up their 23 MiG-29s and they send those to Ukraine. But the problem is that it appears that Poland doesn't really want to do that because at the beginning they actually said like days ago that they would not give up any of their MiG-29s, and then they changed their stance and said we're giving up all of our MiG-29s and we're having them replaced by F-16s that the United States will give us. And then they immediately went afterwards and said, but we're sending the MiG-29s to Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany for the Americans to hand over to Ukraine, which kind of shows that they're trying to find, I guess, a diplomatic way to get out of America's pressure to make them send the aircraft over. But it doesn't really matter who's juggling the responsibility of sending the aircraft over. Either country sending them into Ukraine in a diplomatic way is kind of like telling Russia that we are getting directly involved in this war. We're sending aircraft through the airspace, even if we don't mean to use them and we're just giving them over to the Ukrainians. It'll still be taken that way by the Russians, and the Russians have made it explicitly clear that that's exactly what will happen. So it's kind of the United States trying to push Poland to do something and then kind of like leave Poland high and dry maybe, and the Polish are trying to throw off that problem on the Americans. But what these two countries appear to be forgetting, and this is all my opinion, is that they're both members of NATO, so either one doing it is the same as the other one doing it. So that being said, I hope that answers your question, and thank you very much for the support. I'm very appreciative for any support that we can get at all. And that being said, we're going to move on to the next question.
So the next question is interesting, and we haven't seen anything quite like this. Vasily chips in $20 and asks, states that they have some questions about a frame in a video and provided a link. However, I don't know that you can click on this link and view this during the live stream, as this could be an NSFW video. So maybe that's something you could review offline and touch on in tomorrow's stream, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
But the next question that we can address here, trademarks and patents for growing businesses, chips in $20 to the channel and asks, what factors influence where, when, how to mount Ukrainian counter-offenses? Are anti-logistical / sabotage operations more important?
I don't believe. Well, it's kind of a hard question to answer because the actual Ukrainian army is focusing on defending key areas, so they will fight doggedly for cities like Sumi, Kiev, Kharkiv, Kherson. We saw that in Kherson, it was like a toss-up during the first week of the war as to who would actually control it, because the Russians would push them back, the Ukrainians would push them across the river again, and it was a back and forth for several days. So the Ukrainian army's primary focus is to hold on to major cities and thus major roadways that go through those cities, and kind of like stop the Russians from having kind of like free reign to move supplies and vehicles through the rest of the country. It's kind of like the Ukrainian army's main focus. But they're trying to mobilize civilians to attack the Russians' logistics any way they can. So if they have rifles, they attack the logistics units with rifles. They attack the logistics with drones, and not the civilians, but the actual military attacks the logistics with drones. And it is an incredibly crucial part of Ukraine's defense strategy to already screw over the screwed up Russian logistics. But the Ukrainian army's main primary objective on the ground, as we can see, is to hold them like this breakthrough convoy. As far as we know, they've only gotten to Priluki and they haven't gotten farther. And Sumi and Kharkiv and Kiev are all the same, as well as the area around Mariupol, because we could see that the Ukrainian army is holding on to this, although it seems like the position is unattainable now, and it won't be held for much longer, maybe a few days or a week. But they're still holding on to major cities because they're just vitally important to the country. And also, if Mariupol gets wiped out, there's a large dockyard here that Russians can use to unload thousands of troops who've been waiting at sea for some time in the Sea of Azov. So the answer is kind of a little complicated. It kind of depends on what kind of like units you're talking about, because if it's more like civilian territorial defense units that are kind of getting caught behind lines and stuff once the Russians move through, they're focusing on logistics, while the Ukrainian army is focusing on defending major cities and using remote vehicles like drones to attack the logistics convoys that way as well. So I hope that answers the question as best as possible, and thank you very much for the donation. And with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
So Rainier chipping in $10 says, I hate to say this, but Mariupol fighting on and taking major damage to building and people is keeping a lot of Russian troops from being used in other places. Do you agree with him?
I absolutely agree. I actually echoed that earlier in the stream. I was talking about how the city of Mariupol, actually I just covered that a little bit in the last one. The city of Mariupol is currently stopping the Russians from landing about an extra 8,000 troops from what we know in the area that have been waiting out at sea, and for some reason they set these little fleets up like naval invasions, but they're actually waiting for the ground forces to do all of the work, and then they just land the forces at these ports. But they're waiting for Mariupol to be taken to land those extra 8,000 troops. And we don't know how many troops the Russians are currently dedicating to trying to clear out Mariupol from Ukrainian defenders, but we know that it must be a decent amount because we can see every day that there's a lot of evidence of firefighting and so on going on in the city of Mariupol. So that being said, I do entirely agree that them holding on to Mariupol is tying up valuable Russian resources that could be used elsewhere. And that's why, although I think the situation is hopeless, it's kind of like a becoming a martyr to help out your country or your cause, because them holding for however long they can from now and until when they fall will help the Ukrainian cause so much in holding the front lines, where several extra thousand troops could be positioned if they weren't already fighting for Mariupol. So I hope that answers the question, and I thank you very much for the support. Everyone who supports the channel, I thank greatly, because y'all do a big service and it's a great help to us here at the channel. And so I thank you very much. And with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
Okay, so I'm going to acknowledge a bulk of users who have not necessarily attached questions, but are just saying thank you. We have Mohammed, chipped in $5 earlier, and unfortunately his comment did need to be deleted because it had some external politics attached to it. We have a unpronounceable name chipped in $4.99. It says thank you for the daily summary of the war in Ukraine. Engineer Boy chips in $1.99. And I guess this technically is formed as a question, but I don't know what it means. It says, can you add the days to their own map layers? Okay, I guess that kind of makes sense.
I kind of have the best I can, because doing an independent map for this means I would have to spend a whole lot of time setting up the map each day to then lay out the stuff on it, and that would take up a lot of time that I use for law school, college, and also compiling the information daily. So sadly I can't, but if you go to the map legend in the top left corner, it tells you what each color marker means, so what days are which, and I believe that's the best I could do. I'm sorry that I can't make this any more detailed, and we are looking into trying to make this a lot more legible and understandable, because I do know that it has some issues with that, but at the moment it has to stay this way just due to limitations. So I'm very sorry for that, but I thank you for the support.
Okay, so continuing on with the not really questions, we have Mark Bohiachuk chipping in 5 Canadian for coffee money for you. We have 100 chipping in $5 says great stuff and thank you. We got Yuri B chipping in $20 says keep up the great work, really appreciate the news. James Navarro chipping in £2 says keep up the amazing work, love from the UK. Then we have Look in the Mirror with another $1.49. They were in here yesterday. And then we have CA chipping in $4.99. And those are the ones that didn't really have questions.
And I thank you all so much for the support. I always want to make sure that I try that I thank you each as much as possible, because any support y'all give is once again help for the channel, and help for the channel means we'll be able to produce better content in the future. And so any help that y'all give is a huge deal to me, and so I can't thank y'all enough. And with that, if you would like to, you know how thankful I am, join the Discord, and I'll try and hop in calls whenever I can. I don't have a lot of free time, but I will try the best I can and try and, have conversations with all of y'all and stuff, because I just thank y'all all so much for the support. And so, that being said, we're probably going to answer a few more questions. And so I'd like to say this before we move on to the questions. If you're thinking about donating at this point, I would suggest that unless if you don't have a question you want answered, you don't, because the stream will be wrapping up here in the next few minutes. And so I don't want anyone, giving a donation with a question that I leave hanging here. So if you're thinking about asking a question and donating, just don't donate and ask the question, and we'll try and answer it if we can. And so, next question.
So you are sitting on a backlog of 8 comments that do have donations attached to them. Ski XD chips in $2, stressing the importance of the need for a no-fly zone.
Oh, the importance of a no-fly zone is very important, but that does have to be understood that if a no-fly zone is established, NATO aircraft are going to directly shoot down Russian aircraft, which that's practically a declaration of war against Russia, and so that would start World War III. And so while I do feel, my personal convictions is that we should do what's right no matter how difficult it is or how rough things may become, but we do always have to remember that there is a bit of a balance here in between, going into full-scale war or not, and that would be the one thing that would certainly tip the balance into World War III immediately for most of the world. And so, while I do agree with it on a kind of like personal level, I can see why a lot of politicians of all these countries around the world seem reluctant to really go full force into that, because the implications behind it are incredibly dire and very severe. And so, I hope that answers your question, and thank you very much for the support, and we're going to move on to the next question.
So next question comes in from Knuckles, who had a question earlier, and since there is such a long queue of questions, we do have to develop some sort of sorting method. And I know that it's super crude of a sorting method, but I currently do sort them by donation amount because that's what makes sense to me. However, Knuckles chipping in $9.99 highlights asking if there's any donation amount required for their questions to be seen, and absolutely there is not. Any question that is attached to donation will be read, excluding when you're past the cutoff time, of course. And then Knuckles' earlier question is, I heard today some soldiers from, I believe, Great Britain went to Ukraine with being told not to. Do you believe that's going to cause escalation?
I do not believe that will cause escalation, because if the British told them not to, if the Russians told them not to, then who cares? But if the British told them not to, and then they go over there, the British have kind of waived themselves of all liability for these men, because they will claim that they weren't acting on behalf of the British. They told them not to go, and then they wound up there, and they're not really responsible for those people anymore once they make it clear that they're not supposed to go over there, and then they just wind up over there. And so if anything happens to these British people, just kind of like carrying on to this a little bit more, if anything happened to them, like they were captured and the Russians said, we'll exchange them in return for something, the British would probably say something like, we're not exchanging them because they weren't even supposed to be there. We told them not to go. And so I thank you very much for the support, and I hope that answers your question. And so we're going to move on to the next question.
Next question comes in from the Meme Bandit. Although they did end up deleting their message, so I guess I shouldn't read that one actually. Next one comes in Takata Store, chipping in 5 Canadian. This is question. Putin said that weapons sent from other countries will hurt Russian soldiers. Could the senders suffer consequences?
The senders really can't suffer any consequences as of now, as I can think of, rather than outright war, with the West, which is something that is kind of on the fence, but probably won't happen, because the West has generally already pulled so much of their business out of Russia that there's really nothing Russians could do, like we're going to shut down McDonald's as like a statement against America, because as you know, KFC, McDonald's, and so on, so on and on and on and on, tons of companies have already just shut down completely in Russia, and they're no longer operating any business there. And so I don't really think there's a way anymore for the Russians to lash out at the West and cause economic consequences. I believe the only thing they have left now is to just pretty much go to war. And so I hope that answers your question. And with that, I also thank you for the support, and we're going to move on to the next question.
Use the Cat, chipping in 5 Australian, says, And with that being said, we're going to move on to our next witness, which I believe is humorous commentary related to your future career goals.
Yeah, and I guess it could kind of be tied into me saying, and we'll move on to the next question as well, because it sounds a lot like that. I thank you so much for the little funny thing. That actually made me laugh a bit. And I also thank you for the support. All the support that I get is highly appreciated, and I appreciate everything that anyone does, comments, watches, donations, anything. I thank you all very much for it, and I thank you once again for the support. And with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
The next question is from Vitalia, chipping in €2, who states that their question was skipped before on transinitry, which I cannot pronounce correctly. And apologies if questions fall through the cracks. That is not at all our intent.
Yes, I'm very sorry for that, and I hate that it was skipped. I can't actually see the live chat, so I don't know if chats are skipped or not. So I'm very sorry about that. That was not intended by any of us on the channel. And so if you were talking about Transnistria, I believe I covered that already, but I'll cover it again. I don't really think Transnistria will become anything important during this kind of like course of this war, because it requires an airhead to supply, because there's no supplies to be had in Moldova. Moldova is actually kind of like in not really good relations with the Russians. It's just this little kind of like fake country inside of Moldova that is. And so there would just be too much to try and do airhead wise, flying aircraft across Ukraine to supply these little rebels, or whatever that you want to call them, to actually make them of any effect. And so I don't really think they'd be useful. And I'm sorry for your question being missed again, and I hope that does answer the question. And I can't tell you I'm sorry enough, because I really hate that happened. I have a policy that we don't miss any question. So I'm terribly sorry about that. And with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
Next up, Kay, chipping in $20, says, thanks for the great intel. It's hard to find real news. Will Russia stop at just capturing oil and resources, or will they bring in experienced troops and hit harder?
I don't think they have any more harder troops to hit with. I may think it actually is true when Russia said they sent in mostly contract soldiers, because if we look at their equipment, for the most part, it actually came in pretty good. It was like T-80Us, T-80BVMs, et cetera, et cetera. It's just good stuff. And now we can see that as the war's starting to drag on, the equipment they're bringing in is starting to look of lower and lower quality. So I believe they're now starting to bring in conscripts, and there's nothing better they can throw at the Ukrainians as of now. And so I hope that answers the question. And with that, I also, once again, thank you very much for your support. Any help at all is highly appreciated on my channel. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
Okay, and also to reiterate, please don't post any new questions with donations attached to them, because they won't be able to be captured in this video. Evolution Tactical, chipping in $20, says, was a 16-year U.S. Army infantryman, 11 Bravo, Intel, and SFAB. You are right on point. Hit me up anytime if you need help.
Well, thank you very
SFAB,
much.
I guess.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the support. I'm always happy that military veterans find a lot of credibility in what I'm saying, because I actually don't have any prior experience in the military, or any experience at all in the military. And so what I'm basing all of my knowledge off of is what historically happens when certain situations occur inside of a war. And so that's what I'm going off of. It's not based in any sort of military schooling or anything like that. It's just all based off of historical context and what would have happened if this was a prior war and the same thing occurred. So I thank you very much for the support. I'm always thankful for any support we get, and so I thank you very much, and thank you for your service. And with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
Chuck T, chipping in $5. Odessa, impossible for Russia to hold down due to over 2,500 miles of tunnels running under entire city.
I know what he's talking about. He's talking about the catacombs. Yes, that's very true, and it'd be very hard for them to crack down on resistance, considering that there are so many miles of I don't really know if they're catacombs or mines. I believe they may have been mines. Usually catacombs are, and then they turn into catacombs. But nonetheless, the amount of tunnels under the city would make it impossible to really crack down on any resistance in a high respect. And so that being said, it would be impossible for them to really hold it. They could capture it, on paper and actually control the surface, but below ground would be an entirely different story. And so, thank you very much for the support. I hope I agreed with you. And with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And this is the final question that made it into the queue before you had your cutoff. IT guy says, or chipping in 499 says, some media are reporting Chernobyl has lost power. Curious what you think about this.
As far as I know, well, yes, Chernobyl has lost power, but the reactors are not going to lose cooling as of now. They currently have diesel generators running, and they say there's enough fuel for them to run for 2 days. And so it's a race against time to get the power established back to the plant, or, you know, there will be some kind of critical meltdown, perhaps. Or they'll have to try and fuel those generators, one or the other. It's going to affect the Russians and the Belarusians more than it will the Ukrainians, because the jet stream is always going to make the radioactive material that comes out of Chernobyl flow north up towards Belarus. And that's why the best radiological data collection centers are inside of Sweden, because most of the jet streams of anything that happens in Russia kind of like flow upwards over Europe and over Sweden and then down into the North Sea. And so anything that happens with that power plant really won't affect Ukraine much. It'll be affecting Belarus a whole load. And so I hope that answers your question. And how many questions were there that donated before, well, after the cutoff?
We just have a single one, Devrod. I can read it off if you like.
Sure, yeah, we can do that and knock that one out as well.
Devrod donating about the equivalent of $3 says, question, are you worried that flooding Ukraine with weapons and random fighters could turn into Syria 2.0?
I don't really think so, because it looks like, at least from what we're seeing, the Ukrainians have an extreme level of control over their military, and that's an incredibly good thing in war, because you obviously don't want to start losing control and communications with all of your units. So I don't really think that's actually going to turn into Syria 2.0. I think it's actually helping them out, because they can they have so many troops now that they can actually rotate a lot of them and keep a decent amount of them in reserve, most likely, or they're putting a lot more of them on the front where they're needed. But regardless, I don't really think that'll lead to Syria 2.0. But I thank you very much for the question, and I will answer one unpaid question, and I believe that'll be the last one for the night.
And just to reiterate, I have snuck in a few of the non-paid questions just to make sure that we're addressing not just people who are donating.
Okay, that's good. I like that. Yeah.
Anyway, so next question. What are your thoughts on McDonald's shutting down in Russia?
I think that's actually a very interesting thing. McDonald's actually has around 857 locations inside of Russia, so shutting them down, at least what I was thinking was, oh wow, they've just unemployed a whole bunch of people, you know, probably thousands of people, and those people are going to be not getting paid. But then McDonald's did a weird thing, and they did kind of like a 180, and they said, well, we're shutting down the stores, but we're still going to pay the employees. And that's kind of like a saving face thing in Russia, so that way when this holding ends, they can kind of just reopen and begin business as usual, and there's not a lot of resentment against them. Like, there'll be a little bit, but there won't be as much as if they unemployed like tens of thousands of people who were working for them. So that being said, I think it's actually a big deal. It's as big a deal as KFC and Tommy Hilfiger and Dwar and all of these companies shutting down all of their stores in Russia. So I do think it's a big deal, and I think that that's going to start hitting Russia pretty hard as well, but not as hard as the ban on oil that the U.S. Enacted yesterday. And so that being said, I believe that I've answered all the questions I can. I am terribly exhausted tonight, everyone. I'm hardly keeping my eyes open right now. And so I hope I've answered the questions to the best of my abilities. I hope y'all had a good stream tonight and gathered a lot of information that y'all may have not heard throughout the day. And I hope I answered, once again, y'all's questions incredibly well. I thank you everyone who supported the channel tonight. If you would like to join the Discord, there's a link below. If you'd like to take a look at the Day 14 map, there's also a link for that in the description below. And if you like to stream, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps out the channel a lot in the algorithms, and it helps us get out to more people so more people can see this news. And I will see y'all all tomorrow at 10 p.m. Eastern Time for the Day 15 stream. So thank you all very much, and I hope y'all have a great night.
Згинуть на